Good, so here we are in Cardinal Newman's own room, and in the tradition of the oratory, each father, and Newman remained one of the fathers throughout the whole of his life, only has a single room. And even as a cardinal, this was the only room that he had, except for one small adjustment, which I'll explain to you in just a few moments' time. But by and large, this room, as you see it, is the only one that he had as a priest here from the 1850s through to his death. So, as you can see, it's a fairly functional and working room with a lot of books and, of course, principally a desk, or indeed a couple of desks. So it's very much a working space. And one of the things that you notice here is there's this rather handsome, well-used traveling writing desk, a folding writing desk, and also his principal working desk, the slightly sloping desk, with the chair also that he used in his lifetime. And the only non-candle light in the whole room is this very late introduction. This was not actually here for most of Newman's life. It came in the very last years of his cardinalate. Otherwise, he relied all of his life on candlelight. So there is no electric light in this room, and there's no gas light in this room. There was only the light of candles and, of course, the fireplace as well, which provided heat and a certain amount of light in winter nights and in the darkness. The other thing which I would like you to be able to see as well, which you won't see otherwise, is that in the latest copy of the visitor's book, this one was begun in 2010. As you can see, the first person to sign it was Pope Benedict. So it was specially made for his visit here in September 2010. So apart from the bookcases that we've seen and also the desks, there's also this very large cupboard in which Newman kept very carefully organized all his manuscripts, so his sermons, various other manuscripts of his books, when they're preparations for their publication. And also on the cupboard door, we still have a relic of his later years, the members of the community who were down to preach during the year 1888, so just 2 years before the Cardinal's death. So it's a kind of a record of very last years of the Cardinal's life, the names of the fathers in the community at that time. And then also, and sadly very much damaged by time, this cutting from one of the local newspapers from 1884 of a map of the Nile. War was being fought in the Upper Nile, and the battles fought in the Upper Nile during that war, like Kitchener and at Khartoum. So Newman took a great interest in what was going on there and had that on the door so that he could follow the progress of the war as it unfolded. He was also very moved to discover that Kitchener, who was the principal general of that war, had also a personal copy of Cardinal Newman's own poem, Dream of Gerontius, on him at the time of his death, which was then subsequently given to the Cardinal and remains in the possession of the Oratory to this day. So in addition to the Cardinal's study and place where he wrote so many of his enormous number of letters there at the desk, this also would be the place where he would pray privately. So he had his own pregio here in this corner of the room with various prayer cards, devotional books, rosary beads, and also a picture of his patron saint, St John the Evangelist, as well, of course, as St Philip, the founder of the Oratory. We also have here the Cardinal's breviaries, so the ordinary daily office of a priest of the Roman clergy, the Roman Rite. So the daily prayer that he began to pray even while he was still an Anglican. And he did this largely because he inherited from his friend Hurrell Froude at his death in 1836 the breviaries that Hurrell Froude himself, while he was of course still an Anglican at the time of his death, nonetheless he had begun to pray the Roman breviary as an Anglican. And from that time onwards, Newman himself began to study and then to pray the Roman breviary himself. So long before he became a Catholic, this became one of the most important means whereby he grew into the whole devotional life of the Roman liturgy and the Roman priestly prayer life as well. So the breviaries are an important part of the witness of Newman's prayer life. I mentioned that each father in the oratory has only one room of his own, and the cardinal was no exception to that rule. But when he became a cardinal, he adapted his bed space into his private chapel, because it was part of the protocol of being a cardinal that he should have a private chapel. So he converted his bed space into his chapel, and he took the room next door simply for his bedroom, but never officially adopted it as a room of his own. So this became his chapel for the final 10 years of his life. And it has some very interesting relics of that period. First of all, over the altar is a painting of St Francis de Sales, who was a saint very important to Cardinal Newman. Not only was Francis de Sales a disciple of St Philip, but he was also, having been a Catholic bishop in Protestant Geneva, the area around Geneva in Switzerland, he was also a role model to Newman of how to be a Catholic clergyman, a Catholic priest in a very largely Protestant part of the world. And so it was from St Francis de Sales that Newman was to take his episcopal motto, cor ad cor loquitur, heart speaks unto heart. So we'll see evidence of that in a moment as well. To the right of the altar, there are a large number of pictures and memorial cards, all of friends of Father Newman's, going right the way back to his Oxford years. And those are the people that he wanted to be reminded of as graphically as possible whenever he celebrated Mass, so that he would be able to pray for them in the canon of the Mass at the memento. Then also, we have here his cardinal's hat, the official cardinal's hat, or galero as it's called, which wasn't made to be worn, but just part of an emblematic sign of a cardinal's status. So this is very often these are to be seen still in churches where cardinals are buried. This is often hung over their tombs. Of course, obviously the cardinals are buried in a tomb, but buried in a graveyard in Rednall, and the shrine is here. So this has been placed here in his room ever after. And also his prie-dieu, again with cardinalatial scarlet. So in addition to that, there's his cardinal's chair, or full stool as it's officially called, showing also his coat of arms. So the coat of arms which he adopted from his father, a Newman coat of arms, but very appropriately having these three hearts, which gave him the clue for his cardinal's motto, which, as I say, he took from St Francis de Sales, and that is cor ad cor loquitur, heart speaks unto heart. Over sides of the coat of arms, also the name of the church of his Roman titular church, St George of the Golden Veil, George in Velabro, as it's called now, San Giorgio in Velabro. Here we have the vestments that were presented to the newly created Cardinal Newman in 1879 by English Catholics in Rome. So they come from Rome itself. And again, we can see on these, on the white and the red, the most important of the vestments, the liturgical colours, the Cardinal's coat of arms here. So on the white and red, the most worn of the vestments, of course, white and red. So there on the red is again the same. The other colours are much plainer. And this beautiful cupboard, of course, carries not only the vestments themselves, but also the burse that is also used for the chalice during Mass as well. So, as I mentioned, the saint over the altar is St Francis de Sales, and Cardinal Newman had a devotion to him, which was particularly, of course, connected with his life as a clergyman in Protestant Switzerland. And Cardinal Newman's great friend, Maria Gibberne, who did quite a lot of paintings of his family from very early years, also did this series of drawings of scenes from St Francis de Sales' life. It's not complete, but it's actually quite a beautiful set of drawings. Maria Gibberne, as you can see, was a very talented artist and draftsman, and was able to draw very beautifully the features of the saint. So he's very, very clearly identifiable in these drawings, which are very beautifully done. So here we are in the library of the Oratory. This was established here in this very space by Father Newman when he built the house in 1851. So it has been constantly that for the last 170 years. And so it has a very long history to it. The library, as you will see as we go around looking at it, is absolutely full of books. And the most important part of the library, actually, that I want to draw your attention to here, is this section here on the lower level, going up to about 2/3 of the way along the library. And all of these very large folio books, as we call them, the very large scale volumes, mainly 17th and 18th century publications of the fathers of the church. So the great teachers of the faith from the early centuries, mainly from the first 5 centuries, though a few from later centuries are included as well. But we call them the fathers because it is from them that we have learned so much of the faith that we've been given. And they have a particularly important part to play in the history of Father Newman's conversion, because when he was at Oriel as a fellow in the 1820s, and as a clergyman, and he was a tutor of students in the college as well, he was at a certain point given complete freedom, not entirely of his own choice, from a lot of the tutorial work that he had been undertaking. And with the free time that he suddenly found that he had, in addition to his pastoral duties, he began, by great providence, a systematic reading through of the Church Fathers. And this is what began the whole process within him of understanding the Catholicity of the Church, and also the apostolicity of the Church, and the development of the Church's doctrines throughout history. All that was a very important part of the way in which he moved from Anglicanism to Catholicism. So the process which came to its climax in 1845 with his conversion, reception into the Church by Father Dominic Barbary, was in many ways started by all that's contained within these volumes that you see here. So during the 1820s, mainly the 1830s and 40s, the young Mr. Newman was reading the Church Fathers, and he gradually acquired personally this enormous library of Church Fathers due to a very happy accident, largely, and that was that in the aftermath of the Napoleonic Wars, when Napoleon and the French revolutionary armies had largely disrupted most of the monastic houses and their libraries throughout France and Germany particularly. Many of the books that had been contained in those monasteries found themselves in Paris, being sold very cheaply in book barrows on the banks of the River Seine. And Newman himself, though he didn't travel abroad very often, the famous case, of course, his journey to the Mediterranean, and especially Sicily in 1832 and 1833, but apart from that, he didn't generally travel abroad very much until he became a Catholic, in fact. But he would find out friends who were traveling to Europe, and he would ask them to obtain volumes on his behalf, which they would then buy for him and bring back to him in Oxford. And so it was that gradually over those years he built up this wonderful collection of the Church Fathers. So all the great Church Fathers that he often came to quote in his mature years, so such as the great St Athanasius. We'll see in fact in the church there is an altar dedicated to St Athanasius because of the great devotion that Father Newman had to Athanasius. And obviously other great saints like St Gregory the Great, St Leo the Great, Cyril Alexandria, and many others besides, St Augustine, of course. These all are to be found on these shelves here. When Father Newman was received into the church by Father Dominic Barbary, he was so thrilled to be at last a member of the Catholic Church, because he said now he was in fact a member of the same church at long last as these great fathers whom he'd been studying in close detail for the previous 10, 15 or so years. And so he went around, as he said, on the night of his conversion, drawing out the volumes and kissing them and saying, "Now at last I belong to you." It was very much the way that he saw his conversion, as a coming home to the Church of the Fathers. And that's why these are such an important monument to the whole of Newman's intellectual life and his development as a Catholic. One of the things that I've mentioned downstairs in the museum is that that John Henry Newman was a great musician throughout all of his life, right from the age of 10 when he started to learn the violin to his very late years. Though at the very last years of his life he didn't continue to play because he said that he found it difficult to keep in tune. But he did enjoy continuing to listen to music, especially to the singing of the church choir at High Mass on Sundays when he was no longer able to celebrate himself, but would sit by the sacristy door and listen to the singing of the choir. And this represents his own active interest in music. This is his viola, which of course we still preserve. Of course, he played both violin and viola from the time that he was in Oxford, when he was very much involved actively in music making as a member of a rather ad hoc group of musicians playing string quartets. So Newman was proficient enough to be invited very frequently to play either second violin or viola with some professional musicians in performances of Haydn and Mozart and even some of the Beethoven string quartets. Beethoven was in fact Newman's favorite composer, and he enjoyed very much playing Beethoven's violin sonatas. And some of those he played with his sister Jemima, who was herself an extremely good pianist. And it was through music and through the playing of Beethoven's sonatas that he and Jemima were at last reconciled in the 1860s after 20 or so years of estrangement between Newman and all the rest of his family members. And so it was the music of Beethoven that brought him and his sister Jemima back together to friendship once more. And also, from after Newman's lifetime, a very important document which we have is the score of the Dream of Gerontius as set to music by Sir Edward Elgar at the very end of the 19th century. And it was performed, first of all, here in Birmingham at the Town Hall in 1900. And although the first performance of the work didn't go particularly well, it was eventually given a much better performance in other settings, and became quite a famous work and attracted the attention of musicians abroad, so that Elgar became at last an internationally renowned musician, largely due to this work. And after the work was finally printed, Elgar dedicated the manuscript of the work, of which this is a photocopy, to the memory of Cardinal Newman, and gave it as a gift to the library of the Oratory, with deepest reverence to the memory of Cardinal Newman, whose poem, he said, "I have had the honor to attempt to set to music." So this wonderful and very famous setting of the Dream of Gerontius is something which we have the privilege to keep the manuscript of here as well. Also famous as a Newman disciple, though one who didn't know him personally in the same way, who was very much under his influence, was the great author J.R.R. Tolkien, who was a convert to the faith along with his mother and his brother, and as a result of which his mother, who was widowed, was also estranged from her family and came to live here in Birmingham, where she came under the protection of the Oratory Fathers. And when she herself died, while Tolkien and his brother were still young boys, she had them placed under the protection, the wardship of Father Francis Morgan, who was a priest of the Oratory at the time. And so it was under his guardianship that Tolkien came to maturity. And what we have here, in fact, is Mabel Tolkien's trunk. So Mabel, that is Tolkien's mother, left behind this trunk, which we still have here as part of the Tolkien family property. And so Tolkien, who of course eventually wrote such famous works as The Lord of the Rings, was brought up very much in the shadow of this house and with the guardianship of one of the Oratory Fathers. And so the influence of Cardinal Newman and the Catholic faith is very much to be found in his works. This is a memento of that important connection between Newman and Tolkien.